Kathleen, can you ask me in front of all of these people, all of these witnesses, can you please ask me, am I going to play Obi-Wan Kenobi again?
Ewan?
Yes?
Are you going to play Obi-Wan Kenobi again?
Yes.
How does it feel to be coming back to these characters after 20 years? I mean, obviously everybody's into it. How are you feeling?
Ever since Disney took over, this is the story that I've wanted told since the beginning.
Hello there. Oh, that's what everyone's saying on YouTube, I bet.
But I'm going to watch Obi-Wan Kenobi now and I'm going to enjoy it because, I mean, it's gonna be amazing. We all know that, right?
A long time ago in a galaxy far away.
I'm gonna cry already.
I think I'm getting teary.
See what I mean? I've lasted 2 seconds.
God, I'm so emotional already. What the fuck?
Oh my god. Like, the show hasn't even started yet.
Ready for your eyes to piss some tears?
I didn't expect I would already be crying while it hadn't even started yet, but here we go.
Stop this, I'm gonna cry.
Oh my gosh, oh my gosh, okay. Oh my gosh. This is happening. We're watching this right now.
I'm gonna need medical attention after this.
You believe it's
Chills.
boy?
Damn, I get me chills.
I just got chills. I just got chills, guys.
Ooh, so many emotions.
Kenobi. Obi-Wan. Kenobi.
Perfect start.
This is so exciting.
Oh my god. Are we on Order 66 as the younglings?
Jesus. Order 66, bro.
Dude!
How are you not? I got sunshine shooting out of all my orifices right now.
I know, I can't.
Yeah.
All right, that was a really good first episode of the Obi-Wan show.
Dude, that was so good. I'm so happy with how that went.
That was very good.
Brilliant.
Back, baby.
Oh, Deborah Chow.
Oh, cool.
That was beautifully done. That was a good first episode.
Good job, Deborah Chow.
That's how you do it. That's how you do it, Deborah. Yeah, Deborah. Yeah.
Directed by Deborah Chow. Amazing.
Directed by Deborah Chow. That was a really good first episode.
Oh, wow, that's so amazing.
Really great first episode, you guys.
All right. I mean, I thought it was a really good first episode.
Honestly, every part of this first episode, I am 100% down with.
They know what they are doing.
I can't watch anymore.
Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a critique of episode 1 of the Disney Plus series Kenobi. For those tuning in, I have a few points I feel need to be addressed before we dive into the critique, so I please ask for your patience at this time. As my audience might be well aware at this point, being able to delve deeply into the inner workings of any film is what allows for myself, and any other person also being so willing to do so, to understand the mechanics of the media in terms of how it was created and for what purpose the story is attempting in its depiction of its characters and how they are utilized in the plot. By doing so, it allows for being able to identify whatever flaws may exist in the film and being able to break them down objectively in order to garner a perspective that will allow for others and myself to understand whether the film will be able to stand up to a measure of success, or to whether it will fall flat in terms of its characters and plot. Man of Steel being a prime example of just how far one can go before falling flat. It is what led to my being able to look at how far gone this Star Wars franchise has gone due to the utter inability of Disney in being able to deliver any semblance of a coherent story in a consistent manner, while simultaneously failing to respect the foundation on which it was built. What was once a universe that anyone could explore and grow with its titular characters has now been turned into a cheap cash grab that has unfortunately been milked to the point that it has become a barren wasteland of something that had meant so much to so many for so many generations. What so many rightfully consider the sequels to be an ultimate failure in its destruction of the lore and its characters has now been turned into an endless cavalcade of TV shows comprised of a nostalgic train ride that the vast majority of the general public is subconsciously eating up without stopping to consider just how cheap and hollow those shows truly are. So many people believe The Mandalorian to be the mark of a return to form for this series, which is quite a mystery in and of itself considering just how little progression of character there even is for the titular character of that show. I am well aware that I will most definitely get some vitriol for that comment, but unfortunately, the vast majority of audiences need to hear that considering just how many ridiculous and empty-headed decisions are made on the part of its characters and the filmmakers. To get a deeper understanding, I would suggest the podcast Every Frame a Pause as they go deeper into all of the problems with that show. For anyone curious, I will include a link to their discussion in the description. To go more onto the main point of this critique, it is more to be told with the point that I had not gone into this show with any level of hopeful excitement, but one of morbid curiosity. Not to have anyone believe for me to be going into a show with any semblance of bias, but to show just how far gone Disney has become in destroying these characters. All to the point that it is hard to become excited at the announcement of these shows, but to slowly foster a sense of dread at the thought of which characters this corporation in its head will ruin next. What so many people had so blindly accepted in such a hopeful manner to the return of a fan-favorite character, while those same people had simultaneously forgotten what Disney had done to those same characters that we had once held in such a high level of regard. What was once a young and hopeful farm boy, to a Jedi in training that had suffered the consequences for acting too rashly, to becoming a Jedi Knight in his path to ridding the galaxy of evil in his quest to redeeming his father back to the light. Only to then become a hermit who would rather spend his days hidden away on a remote island drinking alien sea cow milk straight from the teat in an effort to avoid facing any consequences for a character decision that caused any person with a semblance of common sense to reel back in horror at the thought that this once beloved character would commit such an act, let alone even condone the idea of acting upon the thought. What was once a charismatic, bold, and daring princess that bravely led a small rebellion in the hopes of toppling an evil empire, inspiring millions of young women throughout the ages to look up to as a figure of inspiration. A character that held out hope for so long to help others wherever and whenever needed, to only end up becoming a divorced mother of a dark side user that ended up leading a further corrupted government that allowed for that very same evil to rise again. What was once a brash, daring, and cold-hearted mercenary that cared not for the weight of the choices that others made in an effort for the betterment of the universe, but for the weight of the paycheck that would fill his pockets at the cost of his freedom. A man who had learned that one small moment of aiding another would lead to such a domino effect of positivity for the galaxy, all the while creating a new life for himself and the people that he loved. All of this to return to the corrupted illegal activities that had ruined his life before, only to then go out in such a shocking manner that only allowed for his only son to aid the one girl that would end up winning the final battle while carrying the mantle of the enemy's name in the closing chapter of this saga. It is a wonder why anyone could be so surprised as to why any individual that would stop to consider whether the quality of any show being produced by Disney at any point anymore could ever be considered a legitimate reason for liking the very thing that they had helped to destroy. One such ironic example of this being in how Disney had sworn upon the acquisition of Lucasfilm back in 2012 that they would rid the franchise of the hate that had been received due to the political nature surrounding the content of the Star Wars prequels. For the end of their sequel trilogy and the beginning of their era of TV shows, they had already lied to themselves and the fans by stating how they would ignore anything relating to the prequels. Yet we have already been given a show called The Mandalorian, which made multiple references to the Clone Wars, the Mandalorian Wars, Ahsoka Tano, Bo-Katan, Boba Fett, the Darksaber, and Order 66 amongst many others. Even more so in the Book of Boba Fett, where we see a Naboo Royal Starfighter, a flashback to Order 66, the Darksaber, and Ahsoka Tano yet again, including Cad Bane. Yet for some reason, the fans had either forgotten how Disney had sworn off any mention of the prequels, or they had decided altogether to ignore it on a desperate effort to cling on to what they believed to be something containing a level of quality by choosing to stay ignorant, which says more about these individuals blindly consuming these corporate products than the shows ever will. It is here that we arrive to Kenobi, a show based on the premise of a war-stricken Obi-Wan suffering from the PTSD of the war in the events that had led to the destruction of the Jedi and the rise of the Empire. An interesting concept starring one of the strongest actors in the prequels. Unfortunately, it was only a small glimpse of hope in a universe that had been irreparably damaged to the point that Disney could only blindly create its new rules while breaking the establishment of what had previously come before. The notion that so many people could be so excited simply for the fact of being able to see a character once held in high regard returning to our screens yet again, without even stopping to consider that this is the exact same scenario and what had only been done to those same individuals in the past 7 years alone, is simply horrifying. What one can only hope for so long has now become an unfortunate reality that Disney will only ever concede is working simply for the sake of being able to feed the world a series of nostalgia bait that everyone will gladly consume in such a blind manner. Right from the very beginning, there is so much to break down in terms of the setup. I had already made it a point to point out just how much Disney had done to destroy not only their own trilogy as well as the OT, but now we have already arrived at the point where the only available resources left to pillage from are the prequels before there will be nothing left. It seems that Disney is so intent on attempting to reclaim any semblance of forgiveness from the fanbase by broadcasting what would seem to be the entirety of the prequels in a 4-minute montage. It is so disconcerting for the fact that neither The Mandalorian nor The Book of Boba Fett has any references to the prequels in the forms of a montage. If the idea of showing the progression of Obi-Wan's character from the beginning of the prequels leading up to the end of Revenge of the Sith and the beginning of this show, then any individual could simply go back and watch the entirety of the prequels. Force-feeding a quick-cut montage does not show the progression of his character, nor does it carry any semblance of the emotional weight for the events that had shaped this individual's eventual outlook on his views towards the Jedi. If anything, Disney is hoping beyond hope that we will be so focused on relying on this montage in order to understand the broader story when they fail to realize that the people watching the show are already aware of the events of the prequel trilogy, hence why they were watching it in the first place. Not only is the recap itself bizarre, but the music accompanying the recap does not fit the tone of what is being presented. The prequels were not meant to be portrayed in such a grand tale of epic proportions and how the Jedi rose to power, but rather the tragic fall of the Jedi amidst the rising power of the Sith and their enemies' attempts at creating a new empire. The music being incorporated here is what one might be able to expect for the stock music that would be revamped in order to accompany a Marvel movie trailer. If your goal is to set a tone within the first 2 minutes by using a montage, then would it not follow that you would not choose to use the music that had already been created for the prequels instead of music that amounts to nothing? If the idea was to remind the audience of the media that had come before this show, that would have been perfectly fine if not for the fact that this show is being hosted on the same platform that has those very same movies readily available to watch at any time. If your end goal is to establish these characters up front by creating a montage, then this show is already failing based on the premise that that same amount of time could have instead been utilized to establish the characters already present in your show.
And I didn't work with the writers, but I read all the different variations, all the different iterations of the script going forward. So I was asked my opinion. I wasn't like working with the writers, but I was giving my 2 cents worth, I suppose. The young people who loved the films when they came out, we didn't really hear their voice at the time, because there was no social media or anything. We just heard the critics' voice, and the critics were pretty negative about them. I had to take Obi-Wan from there to bridge a gap between my last work as Obi-Wan and then Alec Guinness in A New Hope. And we just sort of brainstormed that. We thought about it. The film was going to be a movie at one point. At the beginning of the series, Obi-Wan Kenobi's not the man he used to be. He even says that. I've sort of felt over the last 5-10 years the warmth for our prequels that we made. And when they came out at the time, we didn't feel that. The critics didn't like them. But the generation we made them for, the children who watch those films, they really love them.
Sure.
Our Star Wars films are their Star Wars films. So now that I feel that, it's nice to make something like this, and for fans who are going to make people happy is a nice thing, isn't it? Then I guess what happened was I kept getting asked, and would you play Obi-Wan Kenobi again? And I started thinking about it, and I started thinking, well, there must be actually a good story to tell between episode 3 and 4. And I also started feeling this warmth for the films that we made from the people we made them for. Series Deborah Chow became our director, thank God, because she's so good. Yes. She's so talented, and because she directed all of the episodes, it's got her singular vision throughout.
In the beginning, we are reintroduced to the planet Coruscant, where we are given an establishing shot of the Jedi Temple at night. We then see a Jedi Master instructing several children in the ways of the Force, What is interesting to note is the fact that these children are wearing these specific helmets. To elaborate, in Episode 4, A New Hope, when Luke has begun to train as a Jedi, he is beginning to learn to use his lightsaber. When Luke is deflecting the blaster fire, Obi-Wan places a helmet with the blast shield down in order to have Luke learn to rely on his senses in the Force. This method works and allows for him to rely on his instincts rather than his outside perception. For Episode 2, Attack of the Clones, we see several of the children wielding practice sabers along with helmets with the visors down in an effort to aid their Force abilities. It is a continuation from what had been shown previously, and it shows a level of effectiveness and the simplicity that is continuity. What is confusing here is the purpose in continuing to carry over the helmets when the children are not even practicing with their lightsabers, but rather mimicking the movements of their instructor. If the only other purpose for those helmets is to help the viewer identify these individuals as children, then that is simply nonsensical, as any individual containing even an iota of common sense would be able to tell just by a brief glance that these are children. At this point, the doors to their training room opens where 2 clone troopers enter, one of whom immediately fires off 4 shots before the Jedi instructor is able to activate her lightsaber and commence her attack. At this point, we have only just begun the critique, and there are so many fundamental issues in terms of mechanics and world building that need to be addressed before we continue any further. With any piece of media, it is imperative that you establish the groundwork and the way in which you want to present your story to the audience. For the film Chronicle, it is based on the premise of a found footage style detailing a superhero and supervillain origin story. Throughout the story, it is told from the figurative and literal lens of Andrew's camera, along with news reports and police dashboard cameras in order to chronicle a story. One such instance of this style being in the way the film's overall presentation is utilized is with the way in which Andrew discovers that he can use his abilities to lift his camera into the air, guiding it with his mind, which allows for a more freeing expression of filmmaking. It not only fits with the film's overall theme and the idea that your mind is what allows for you to become free, that your abilities are not what shape you, but in the choices you make and the way in which you use your abilities. In The Amazing Spider-Man and Spider-Man Homecoming, at multiple points we are given multiple shots from the first-person perspective, allowing for the viewer to get a brief glimpse into what Spider-Man would experience whenever he is swinging from its webs. Even a single moment of seeing this instance of a joyous level of flight allows for the audience to understand the protagonist just one step closer. In this instance for Kenobi, the stylistic choice of having the viewer following this Jedi instructor as she attempts to guide these children to safety is an interesting dynamic that unfortunately falls flat. If the idea is that the camera is meant to portray, as well as follow, the action, it would be a perfectly legitimate portrayal the moment that the action would have begun the moment that the clones had entered the room. The idea and execution in that the camera would begin shaking incessantly for no reason before the action had even occurred, other than to implant the idea in the mind of the viewer that we are about to experience a level of action is lost before it has even begun. Once again, the idea of following this instructor as she would attempt to ferry the children to safety is an idea that contains some level of merit. If the camera were to be stationary while in the room, only to then be picked up or shaken in response to the movement of going from one room to another, then that would be a logical progression of the scene as we would be experiencing the same level of danger as the characters. Preemptively moving the camera when the action is only started before the characters have even left the room will simply cause the scene to lose any momentum it may have built due to the abject failure in destroying the framing before it can even properly set the tone. Beyond the logistics of this opening shot is the matter of the clones and their ability, or rather inability, to carry out the effectiveness of the order in which they were given the task of executing. In multiple forms of the media, whether it be the Clone Wars cartoon or the third prequel film, we are shown the level of accuracy and precision these clones carry in their ability to fight amidst the scope of the war they were set in. The idea that not only one, but both of these clone troopers would miss their target so close to the vest when you realize that they're standing only 6 feet away is simply nonsensical. Whether it be the idea that the Jedi would have preemptively sensed their presence due to the Force would have been an easy way to resolve this issue in allowing for her to dodge the blasts. Here, however, it is only shown after the first 2 shots had been discharged that the Jedi had dodged the last 2 shots before igniting her lightsaber. The idea of the Jedi's inability to sense the intrusion of the clones raiding their temple, along with the countless deaths of the other Jedi in the temple, simply presents a new set of problems due to this issue. From the very beginning of Obi-Wan's introductions in A New Hope, he immediately begins to inform Luke about the Force and the way in which it is implemented by the Jedi.
The Force? The Force is what gives the Jedi his power. It's an energy field created by all living things. It surrounds us and penetrates us. It binds the galaxy together. I felt a great disturbance in the Force. Remember, a Jedi can feel the Force flowing through him.
With the blast shield down, I can't even see. How am I supposed to fight?
Your eyes can deceive you. Don't trust them.
You mean it controls your actions?
Partially, but it also obeys your commands.
He is able to impart this knowledge onto Luke upon the beginning of Luke's Force training, telling him to ignore his physical surroundings in order to rely upon the Force's ability to aid him in utilizing his instincts. In The Empire Strikes Back, upon the continuation of Luke's training with Yoda, he is able to receive a vision from the Force, alerting him to the fact that his friends are in danger. In Return of the Jedi, he is able to sense Vader's presence, once while on the way to his mission, and the second time while on the forest moon of Endor. To bring up the point from earlier, in Attack of the Clones, we had seen many children being forced to rely on the Force in order to block the blaster fire from their training droids. Multiple times we have been given examples to show how the Force works to bolster the fact that the Jedi are trained as early as infants in order to better hone their abilities. The reason this issue is being brought forth is due to the fact that upon the command of Order 66 being given and the deaths of thousands of Jedi everywhere, it is quite a bit of a stretch to suggest that the Jedi everywhere did not feel this sudden change in the Force. Upon the destruction of Alderaan, Obi-Wan had immediately collapsed from having sensed the countless number of lives lost. Per the beginning of the death of the Jedi, Yoda could only recoil in horror and pain at the fact that he was able to sense the death of so many of the students that he had once trained. These two instances being clear indicators that the Jedi are fully capable of being able to sense the changes in the galaxy, let alone their current environment that they are currently occupying. That they wouldn't be able to sense the deaths of 4 of the most powerful and highest ranking Jedi on the Jedi Council at the hands of the Sith is ridiculous. That the Jedi would not be able to sense the turn of one of the most powerful Jedi to the dark side, the very same Jedi who had been established to have an even stronger connection to the Force than even Yoda himself, is ridiculous. That this same individual storming their temple with thousands of clones, all with the sole intent of destroying the Jedi without the Jedi even sensing the danger, is ridiculous. That this Jedi instructor being unable to sense the number of deaths around her, nor the level of danger until the danger is only 6 feet away from her position, is ridiculous. The purpose of this opening scene being that the writers wanted to reintroduce the audience to the fall of the Jedi is an intelligent, if not cheap move on their part. However, if they are going to ignore any semblance of consistency that was established not just in the original films, but in the very same prequels that they are referencing, then how are we expected to take this show seriously if the writers are unable to follow any form of stability in their foundation? This is why the entirety of the ordeal of Order 66 and its portrayal here is so problematic. You cannot have so many instances in your media where it has already been established how the power of the Force is able to work, only to then backtrack on those instances in order to support your attempt in justifying the idea that the Jedi would be caught off guard simply for the sake of wanting to create drama. That is not creative, nor is it intelligent. That is simply lazy. As to why it would seem that I am spending so much time on the first shot when given the context that this is the opening shot to this show. From a production standpoint, in the way it is implemented into the story shows a lack of regard on the part of the filmmakers if you have all of these resources available to you and this is the creative style that you chose to go with. That this would be the opening scene, let alone the opening shot of your story, is what sets a precedent for the story you are attempting to tell. That there are this many problems before the plot can really begin does not create a level of reassurance. How can anyone be expected to invest any level of interest if its opening sequence is to be displayed on such a level of poor quality? The moment in which the Jedi is able to strike down the clones is a clear example of this. We see the Jedi hit the clone in the left with their lightsaber in his hip across the stomach. Such a wound would have all but immediately caused any individual in this universe to die upon the damage inflicted, but all that is shown is the trooper simply dropping his gun. That a lightsaber wound across the stomach and hip would not cause him to fall down immediately not being ridiculous enough, but that there are no visible marks to show that the lightsaber had made any sort of contact, nor cut through the trooper's armor whatsoever. We are only shown a few sparks and the clone still standing, which does not follow as he should have immediately fallen to the ground dead at that point. The clone on the right continues to fire before the Jedi brings her lightsaber down at a diagonal angle, cutting down the entire length of his body, from the clone's neck down to his hip. For some reason, this clone is also still standing despite being hit with a lightsaber. Not only that, but much like his comrade before him, there are no visible marks from the lightsaber on this clone's armor either. If the argument is that their armor is lightsaber resistant, then that is simply ridiculous as we have seen countless times many clones throughout different media being killed by blaster fire. Not only that, but there are plenty of instances in which clones are shown to be killed by a lightsaber. The The last example being a direct reference to Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith, one of the 3 prequel films being used as a point of reference for the basis of this show's story. It is simply nonsensical that the writers could expect anyone to take this moment seriously if the very media that they are using as the focal point for their story is the very same thing that they are choosing to ignore. Not only are they reducing the effectiveness of the Jedi, but that they would turn one of the most dangerous weapons known to the inhabitants of this universe into nothing more than a glowing baseball bat when we have seen just how dangerous they can be, is absolutely ridiculous. Disney has not only ruined its own canon multiple times, but they are purposely lessening the abilities of the Jedi by such a significant margin in order to have their story play out, which is absolutely absurd in terms of writing. Not only is it indicative in the level of quality in their writing, but it is even more of a contrived method in their ability, or lack thereof, in being able to tell a coherent story if there are this many problems, not including the opening montage, in the first 30 seconds of the opening shot alone. The Jedi then lands a second strike to the clone on the left before landing another second strike to the clone on the right. Only then do they finally die. At this moment in time, the Jedi instructor begins leading the children out into the hallway where we see another Jedi behind them facing down 2 other clone troopers. What is difficult to understand is why it seems that every piece of media must feel the need to make it a habit to write into their script any character that is capable of carrying a long-ranged weapon into an incompetent buffoon that must be standing less than 6 feet away from their target. The purpose of a long-ranged weapon is that it is meant to give you the advantage in keeping a certain set distance between you and your target. Having it so that your characters are walking right up to their target does not follow any logical sense if their goal is to take the life of their target while preserving their own. Perhaps the idea is that it is due to the limited space surrounding the area, as they are limited to the length and tight corridors of the hallway. However, that issue could have simply been fixed by either showcasing a wider area or showing the clones at a distance taking down the Jedi. The latter option would allow for showing how effective the clones can be while simultaneously showing their intelligence regarding the level of attentiveness they carry in regards to their situational awareness. That was always meant to be the idea of the clones, as they were created from the genetic template from such a strong-minded and able-bodied bounty hunter. That is not meant to be an assumption, as Jango Fett was specifically targeted to be the host template for this clone army. Having it so that these clones are making such detrimental errors when they are what comprises the might of the elite force of the 501st Legion, led specifically under the newly anointed Darth Vader, is simply baffling as to how they could be portrayed in such an unintelligent manner. Soon thereafter, one of the 2 clones takes notice of the Jedi instructor, which causes him to shoot at her. Deflecting the bolts back at her attackers allows for her to take them down in an effective manner. 2 more troopers then arrive, and yet again, it is further continuing to reduce the intelligence of these clones if they are to see a desperate Jedi running towards them that they wouldn't think to back up or to keep a certain distance. Instead, they simply stand there shooting at the Jedi instructor rather than moving away as they shoot. Surprisingly, the filmmakers remembered that lightsabers actually can cut through almost anything, as the Jedi attacks 2 more troopers and they are actually able to fall from their wounds after the first strike, rather than dying only after being hit multiple times like earlier. Earlier I had commented on the way in which the opening montage had been so undercut with stock action music that it contradicted the tone of what was being shown on the screen. The idea that the footage being presented was meant to portray the fall of the Jedi in such a genocidal manner on such a galactic scale, and that it only resulted in being so jarring to hear such grandiose music being utilized in its execution. Unfortunately, it was a precursor to what was shown in the opening scene depicting the attack on the Jedi Temple. Rather than incorporating any previous music that had already been established, the filmmakers instead chose to go with what would be considered appropriate for what you might expect of a Marvel action scene or chase sequence. Not to say that this music would not be applicable in the Star Wars media, but for its application in this scene is what would only amount to tonal dissonance. We are not meant to view this moment in such a high-strung frenzy of enjoying the spectacle brought before us, but rather a sense of horror at the plight that has befallen the Jedi. You would not watch Revenge of the Sith and expect the same type of music in this opening battle to be used in a moment such as this. So it does not follow that the same type of music would be used here, considering that the same event coincided on the same night as the moment being shown here, especially as the younglings standing before this carnage had only just witnessed their Jedi Master struck down before their very eyes before being forced to summon the courage in order to escape. Not only having to force themselves to escape the level of death surrounding them, but being forced to watch all of the other Jedi in their midst being struck down as they escape. A scene that had amounted to 1 minute and 30 seconds and carrying such a level of errors before we had even been introduced to a character we had not seen in decades is not a strong suit for the first episode of a new series. that the filmmakers would spend 4 minutes attempting to establish some semblance of nostalgia in such a contrived manner, only to then display a minute and a half of wanton chaos in such an uncoordinated fashion is something that should have never occurred, but is what could have been expected regardless.
And he has an apprentice with him called a Padawan, who is this young Obi-Wan Kenobi, played by Ewan McGregor.
The first movie I ever saw in the cinema could possibly have been Star Wars Episode 4.
I mean, Alec Guinness is a character actor, and he's a comedic character actor, and he had this wonderful kind of playfulness in quality about him, even though the role of Obi-Wan is very kind of, straight and strong and all that, but he still had this glint, a little glimmer in his eye. Ewan has that. I mean, Ewan just has this very playfulness, besides being a terrific actor and being able to handle the physical elements of the role and plus the kind of the character.
I was on set with C-3PO and it really took me back. I really remembered what it was like to be 6 or 7 and watching these films, and I felt the excitement of being in them, now.
Came with it was such a great degree of enthusiasm. We'd never seen anybody with the same commitment that he gave, so we were thrilled.
Ewan McGregor, Obi-Wan Kenobi.
Superior for casting Obi-Wan Kenobi was somebody who was complementary to Alec Guinness, but not just sort of copy it, but create an addition to that character.
In the original 3, Alec Guinness was only in the first half of the first movie. He cropped up now and again as a shadowy blue guy, but we only saw him for half the film, and yet he created this iconic figure that I've grown up knowing.
Now to have Ewan McGregor just doing the nuances of Alec as a young man, the charm and the wit and the eye and just the gentility of the guy and the strength.
He luckily resembles Alec, and then he also just has that kind of intrinsic quality that Alec Guinness has.
We see right from the start, from episode 1, that Obi-Wan becomes this little boy, Anakin's mentor and master, and the fact that he's the disciplinarian and he's always telling Anakin off, and Anakin's always been cheeky to him, and there is a father-son thing there, which is nice, and I refer to him in the end of this movie as being like brothers. The first half of this film, you see an incredible bond and a real friendship there, so that there is something important that's lost.
It was extraordinary to stand in front of the mirror with all my wardrobe on and stuff. Because I was Obi-Wan Kenobi, and it was quite a moment for a young man.
We then experience a hard cut to black before we open on Tatooine, set 10 years after the events of the Fall of the Jedi. That at this point in the story of Star Wars that we are being forced to have a story play out on yet another sand planet instead of being able to focus the story elsewhere is beginning to grow quite tiresome. While it is understandable, considering how this series is supposed to tie into the events of Episode 4, that quite a lot of previous media would be so intent on having so many story beats established on so many sand planets is confusing. It is quite an unfortunate irony that a single line from Luke back in 1977 could be used to describe the method in which this one singular planet has become the focal point for any Star Wars writer to establish their story on.
Well, if there's a bright center to the universe, you're on the planet that it's farthest from.
Unfortunately, the way in which they utilize the other planets in the galaxy in this series is so utterly bewildering when you remember the whole point of this series was meant to show the way in which Obi-Wan protected Luke over the years, while simultaneously dealing with the PTSD of the events leading up to this series. That they would divert their attention away from the potentiality in terms of character development for currying favor by means of flash and spectacle is not what could be considered the ideal setting for re-establishing a fan-favorite character. We are then given several establishing shots of the locals detailing the way in which they live their day-to-day lives on this barren planet, which is just a bit too forced considering we had already had plenty of establishment back in episode 4 and all throughout Anakin's journey in the prequels. A large shadow looms overhead in the form of a warship signaling the arrival of the Empire. Upon the lowering of the ramp, we are given our first look at the debut of the live adaptation version of the Grand Inquisitor from the show Rebels, and it is absolutely horrendous. What should have been an imposing figure establishing his strength and fear by his mere presence alone has been decimated by the very fact of just how absolutely ridiculous his makeup looks. For anyone unaware, the Grand Inquisitor's background details that he is a member of the Pawewan species. We had already seen this species previously in Revenge of the Sith when Obi-Wan was on the hunt for General Grievous. What was once a unique design in terms of prosthetics and makeup has now been translated over into looking like a child's application of what they attempted to remember in the design of this character. How telling must it be that a series that had come out in 2022 would somehow have worse makeup and prosthetics than from a film that came out 17 years prior? That the very show that Disney themselves had created and being used as a point of reference for the very same character being implemented here, and this is the design choice that they went with, is absolutely horrifying. The second individual departing the ramp also marking the live-action debut of another character from the show Star Wars Rebels, being the fifth brother, looking just as, if not, even more ridiculous than the Grand Inquisitor. For clarification, what has been displayed in such a manner of a tall, slim, yet imposing figure, with a long face detailing specific facial markings with glassy eyes, has somehow translated to a shorter, out-of-shape figure having any distinct facial markings replaced by a slew of wrinkles and black lipstick. What should have been a unique design now being replaced with an outfit one might expect to have purchased at a Party City for Halloween. The last character to descend being the third sister, her design sticking out the most amongst the others simply for the fact that it is displayed in a manner of what should be expected for a show with a budget as large as this one. What is confusing is why this one character that had never been introduced before has the better overall design, versus the other two characters that had already been established for so long being displayed in such a ridiculous manner indicative of what has been expected from the poor quality of Disney's Star Wars. As the Inquisitors make their way to their destination, we are given a strange moment where the Grand Inquisitor stops and makes a hissing noise before continuing on his way. Whether this is meant to show that this individual is meant to be feared cannot be taken as a serious point, considering that most villains never feel the need to make sounds to be intimidating rather than the fact that their mere presence alone would be enough to accomplish that all the same. Here it is simply silly that someone who looks as ridiculous as this individual would stop walking simply to curl his upper lip to look threatening when it only comes off as ridiculous. It should be noted that at this point in the canonical timeline of the Star Wars story, that the Hutts of Tatooine are in power. By that fact, it is due to Tatooine's planetary status of being an outer rim world that the core worlds, such as Coruscant, would not necessarily feel the need to monitor the level of security on this specific planet due to its outer rim status. By that standard, it is why the Empire has left the planet largely unchecked, and why the Hutts are allowed to remain in a position of power and ruling over the planet. By that standard, the fact that the Inquisitors have arrived on this planet should signal that they need to tread carefully on how they act in order to avoid any measure of conflict considering the level of power that the Hutts maintain. The Inquisitors then arrive at a local bar where they greet the bartender. It is here that we get our first glimpse at how the Grand Inquisitor operates. He asks the bartender if he knows who they are, to which he affirms, stating that they are Inquisitors. The Grand Inquisitor questions if he knows what they do, which is a curious question considering that the bartender had already confirmed that he knew that they were Inquisitors. If he was already well aware enough of their status amidst the Empire, then he would surely know their objective. Not only that, but the way in which the dialogue is exposited is written so clunkily if only for the purpose of informing any audience member that would have been unaware as to the status of the Inquisitors. If the idea is to portray these Inquisitors as individuals who hunt Jedi, then the simple act of showing the action of gathering information or questioning the locals as to the location of the Jedi would be more prevalent towards their goals. Stating outright that they hunt Jedi, only to then go into some grandiose speech about how the Jedi are unable to help being compassionate, does not aid them in their goal, as all that will cause is for them to waste precious time that they could be using in hunting the Jedi. It has been established by the Disney canon that Force users are able to use their abilities to peer into the minds of their enemies in order to extract the necessary information that they require. In the possibility of showcasing the Grand Inquisitor or the other Inquisitors using the Force to torture any innocent person by ripping their minds apart for what they require, it would successfully allow for not only the audience to understand just how ruthless these individuals could be, but in that it will allow for the show to create any actual semblance of tension. That the Grand Inquisitor would rather choose the path of wasting so much time instead of just ripping the information straight from the civilian's mind is just a level of potential that is being wasted simply for the sake of creating a false sense of tension that was never there in the first place. It is why the point of the Grand Inquisitor falls apart in stating that the key to hunting Jedi is patience, when the whole point of their entire faction within the Empire is to locate any and all surviving Jedi to wipe them out in order to preserve the reigning dominance of the Empire. He even makes it a point to state how it is the compassion of the Jedi which would leave a trail to follow. Unfortunately, that is contradicted by the fact that the whole point of the Jedi was to detach themselves from their emotions in order to avoid any temptation towards the dark side. Although Anakin's explanation does have its merits in that the level of compassion that is all too similar to the sympathy a Jedi would feel in order to feel the obligation to help others is a wonderful statement of the purpose of a Jedi.
Attachment is forbidden. Possession is forbidden. Compassion, which I would define as unconditional love, is central to a Jedi's life. So you might say that we are encouraged to love.
It had always been an interesting dynamic in how the Jedi could become so detached in order to protect their fear while simultaneously being compassionate enough to be able to love unconditionally in order to help others. The issue here is that while the Grand Inquisitor may be correct about that aspect regarding compassion, it is written to the point that it is on a level of self-awareness as to how villainous they are if they are to shame someone for having compassion. Dialogue does not always have to be so on the nose in order to set a precedent for how questionable a villain may be in terms of just how truly evil they are, but rather a measure of subtlety that could be included. Not necessarily a need to directly state their intentions, but to slip in an underhanded manner just an iota of a threat to the bar owner that he could simply comply lest he suffer the consequences for hoarding a criminal. The entire point of the Empire is to establish a stronghold on the galaxy by a form of institution in the regulation of policing the planets in which they control. It is why we see multiple troopers on Tatooine in Episode 4 when they stop Obi-Wan and Luke to check for the droids that they were searching for. It is the same scenario as on Jedha in Rogue One when we see several squads patrolling the area. It is a method in fear that they control their territories which allows for them to maintain their order. Here the Inquisitors have arrived without considering those prospects while simultaneously causing damage. It lends back to the point in how the Inquisitors could have simply retrieved this information by this point if they were to use the dark side to rip the information from the minds of their enemies. It would also allow for the audience to understand the viewpoints of the Inquisitors and how they believed their methods in using the dark side would alter their perception into believing what they were doing to be justified when it wasn't. Instead, choosing to waste time is somehow the better alternative for these individuals. It has even gotten to a point that the Grand Inquisitor has monologued to such a degree that the third sister had chosen to grab a knife to throw at the bartender in order to lure the Jedi out. There is even a shot where the third sister looks around to see who caused the knife to be halted, along with a shot of the Grand Inquisitor looking back. It would lead the viewer to rationalize that the third sister and Grand Inquisitor had followed the path and being able to detect who was using the Force to locate the Jedi. For some reason, however, it is shown how the Grand Inquisitor had instead chosen to look at the third sister instead of the Jedi that they had traveled so far in locating that it begs the question of why the Grand Inquisitor would act so surprised towards the third sister's actions if the whole purpose of their mission was to locate this Jedi in the first place. It has simply gotten further past the point of showing just how absurd this live-action portrayal of the Grand Inquisitor has become if the third sister has to figuratively and literally point out where the enemy is located. Upon the Jedi having been located, he immediately begins running towards the exit, only to run into the path of the fifth brother. One might presume that as these Inquisitors are Force sensitive that the fifth brother would attempt to hold the Jedi in place by using the Force. For some reason, however, he simply stands still while looking at the Jedi, all the while making a growling noise. I would just like to point out that this show is attempting to take itself seriously as the idea that these characters are meant to be feared when all they have done is display an overabundant level of stupidity in their approach in apprehending their enemies. It even shows when the fifth brother lets the Jedi run to the side past him and he decides to walk slowly towards his enemy who is currently running away. At this point, the third sister has drawn her lightsaber, to which the Grand Inquisitor states to prep the Jedi for interrogation. The fifth brother then takes this as his cue to walk right up to the Jedi without using any form of cuff restraints or even the Force to hold the Jedi in place. The third sister then takes the Grand Inquisitor's order as her cue to attack the Jedi, only for the Grand Inquisitor to halt the blade in the process while knocking her to the side. This allows for the Jedi to escape, bringing down several rafters before making his getaway. That the Inquisitors had located a Jedi and let him escape so easily without continuing to give chase is bewildering. If the argument is that the banister was blocking their path, not only do they have a large surrounding area to maneuver around as the bar has no doors barring their path, but these individuals carry the ability to use the Force and could have knocked the banisters aside. We had also just seen the Grand Inquisitor use the Force to restrain the third sister, but for some reason he decided not to do the same to the Jedi. Perhaps it was due to him having to knock the third sister aside so that the Jedi could be spared in order to be captured. But if that was the case, then the Grand Inquisitor could have simply pulled the Jedi towards himself. That would have kept the third sister from killing him. The Grand Inquisitor would have caught the Jedi and read his mind, and the story would have been over. Unfortunately, it is becoming quite the norm for any character to make such unintelligent character decisions in order for the plot to carry forward. This is evidenced when the Grand Inquisitor berates the third sister for being too reckless, to which she responds that they only ever chase after scraps, to which he states,
"Scraps are all we have left."
That is quite the interesting statement that he would make, considering it is their objective to only ever find, capture, extract the necessary info needed from, and kill the Jedi they encounter. Yet this exchange only ever arose due to the fact that the very Jedi they were chasing was allowed to escape by the very same Grand Inquisitor leading the group tasked to kill those very same Jedi. How is it that the scriptwriters could even decide to write this line after the entirety of the scene that had just occurred and still believe that the scene is carried in a consistent and logical manner? It is what leads into the next statement, wherein the Grand Inquisitor states that the third sister must forget her obsession with finding Obi-Wan Kenobi specifically as her target. What was intended to be an intriguing moment for this character only comes off as a forced line, only uttered for the sake of forcing any semblance of an arc for this specific character. But just to clarify, this specific character feels that because Obi-Wan Kenobi was not at the temple when Order 66 had occurred, then that somehow shifts all of the blame to Obi-Wan, despite the fact that Obi-Wan had only just been betrayed by his own clones at that very same moment. This in turn led to her deciding to join her enemy faction, despite the fact that that same enemy had murdered the same people that she had been raised amongst and viewed as her family. There are simply not enough ways to describe how ridiculously contrived the idea that a character whose own faction had been killed decided to join the enemy faction because one of those original members was unable to help her as a child, all because he himself was attempting to avoid being killed at the same time.
He's a more broken character than we've ever seen him before. We see at the end of Revenge of the Sith that everything that he's known and worked for and worked towards is destroyed. His Jedi Order that he loves and believes in is torn apart. All his friends are either killed or gone into hiding. So he's very, very much alone and lost. And also he's carrying this amazing guilt because he feels that he lost his brother to the dark side and that he should have been able to see that that was going to happen and stop that from happening. So he's not only grieving, he's also feeling responsible for losing his brother. So it's a much darker, more broken place than we've ever seen the character before, either with me or Alec Guinness.
We then transition over to a harvesting site in the open Dune Sea where we see that Obi-Wan has secured a position and working on the removal of the carcass of a large animal. What is perhaps the most unfortunate aspect of these shows being produced up to this point is that the overall story is less appealing than the concept of exploring how these worlds work. That we would be able to see a bunch of poor moisture farmers taking on a job harvesting a large animal on a barren planet is more interesting than the first 15 minutes of what was already shown. If the show were to open featuring a tired Obi-Wan dealing with the day-to-day life of surviving on a barren desert planet, while simultaneously dealing with the trauma and recovering from his PTSD would have carried so much more weight to this character. Rather, we were force-fed a 1 minute and 30-second opening full of production issues and contrivances in regard to the world building. That we would be able to see Obi-Wan, not being celebrated as the Jedi Master regarded as a war hero, but the very same Obi-Wan who would be forced to work under a difficult boss, all within a monotonous schedule of being forced to deal with his own demons on a consistent basis with no support system whatsoever. Even such a visual of his riding away from the civilization on this planet in order to not only hide away from everyone else, but in that he is meant to be portrayed as being so physically and mentally distant to those around him that he would feel uncomfortable in being around anyone else. That this man would have once had so many contacts during the golden era of the Republic where the Jedi peacefully coincided with the Republic in being able to defend any civilian in the galaxy, to then being forced to hide in the shadows lest he incur the wrath of the Empire. That the very person who he has sworn to protect is the son of the very same individual whom he had viewed as a brother for so many years without being able to make contact in order to secure his safety is all the more heartbreaking. When what could have amounted to a story spread out over a season being relegated to a mere 10 minutes of one episode is absolutely demeaning. What could have been a unique timeline in regards to the possible re-establishment of a fan-favorite character on his journey in reconnecting with the Force has now been sidelined for the purpose of telling the story of a far less interesting character. We are given a brief glimpse into that possible story when we see Obi-Wan interacting with a Jawa with whom he has a regular level of correspondence and exchanging parts. It is quite an interesting moment as we see a bit of Obi-Wan's old wittiness re-emerging, as he is not easily fooled by this Jawa with whom he has dealt with enough times to recognize when there is an attempt at being swindled.
If you're going to steal my parts and then sell them back to me, could you at least clean them first, as a courtesy?
Later that night, we are finally allowed to see firsthand the effect of the trauma that he has been forced in dealing with in what would seem to be on a regular basis, constantly interweaving memories of his duel with Darth Vader on Mustafar, versus the young pupil with whom he had built a camaraderie for so many years before being forced to watch that same young man writhe in agony at his very hands. As to why it would be incorporated in such an appropriate manner here when given the context that Obi-Wan would regularly suffer from night terrors, rather than how they utilized the footage from the prequels as a jarring nostalgia trip in the opening 4 minutes alone. In just a few seconds alone, these brief flashes of memory have done a stronger job in referencing the horrors and what the Jedi and specifically Obi-Wan had faced at the height of the war and what would inevitably lead to the death of the Jedi and the death of Anakin Skywalker. An intriguing possibility that could have been showcased would have been the way in which the show could have represented how PTSD could affect the mind of its host and that it could alter the perception of past events. As it had always stood that the memories that are generally remembered on a daily basis are not always accurate to what had actually happened, that the PTSD would cause him to end up damaging his psyche even further due to his inability in accepting what had happened, which would only allow for his character to further sink into his depression. This could have tied into the next moment when Obi-Wan awakened after his nightmare by attempting to reach out to his former master for support and comfort. What is interesting to note is within Obi-Wan's nightmare that we had seen a brief glimpse of a young Anakin piloting a Naboo starfighter. This would be perfectly fine in showcasing the parallel between the young boy whom Obi-Wan had trained versus the monster in whom he was forced to confront. But given the fact that Obi-Wan wasn't even present at that moment to watch Anakin in his ship, it is simply contradictive. This show is actively continuing to destroy the previously established development of this character without even having to say anything in this moment, and they all did this within the span of 1 minute. Obi-Wan then rides over to the Lars homestead where he sees a young Luke pretending to fly a spacecraft. Later that night, we then see that Obi-Wan has left behind a gift for Luke. For those who don't recall, this one scene attempts to explain a moment in Episode 4 where Luke was playing with a toy for all of 5 seconds that we will never see again. Easter eggs are a fun method in drawing the continued interest of its audience.
You've never heard of the Millennium Falcon? It's a ship that made the Kessel run in less than 12 parsecs.
This is a Millennium Falcon. This is a ship that made the Kessel run in 14 parsecs.
12!
What a piece of junk!
What about that ship?
That one's garbage!
Here's where the fun begins.
This is where the fun begins.
I have a very bad feeling about this.
I got a bad feeling about this.
I have a bad feeling about this.
I have a bad feeling about this.
I have a bad feeling about this.
I've got a bad feeling about this.
Oh, I have a bad feeling about this.
Got a bad feeling about
Hey.
Quiet.
What?
But in the case of drawing inspiration from a moment that only lasted 5 seconds, it will simply come off as desperate. At this point, on the way back to his cave, Obi-Wan is interrupted by the Jedi from earlier as he emerges and introduces himself to Obi-Wan. Obi-Wan can only attempt to buffer the man's insistence on his identity, which is quite an intelligent move on the part of Obi-Wan in evading any measure and avoiding drawing the attention of his enemies. The Jedi insists that he is not mistaken in knowing Obi-Wan's identity, introducing himself as Nari, before presenting his lightsaber as an indicator of being a surviving Jedi.
What?
The fact that this individual was able to produce this lightsaber at this moment highlights the issue of incompetency on Nari's part if he is so desperate to survive. Yet when presented with the threat of the enemy faction that he would not think to draw his lightsaber earlier, if the attempt being made was to avoid being identified as a Jedi, that was ruined the moment that he used the Force in order to save the bartender's life. At that moment, his secret was compromised. There was no point in attempting to stay hidden any longer. It would have been imperative at that moment to draw his lightsaber to defend himself, even more so as he had come so close to losing his life if not for the questionable methods of the Grand Inquisitor in halting the Third Sister. Not only that, but that Nari would choose to stay hidden at the same bar whose walls bore the marks that the Grand Inquisitor was able to recognize as having been made from a lightsaber. In this instance, those marks having been made by Nari. That this Jedi would be able to recognize Obi-Wan is a direct statement to the fact that this Jedi would have been made well aware enough of the heroic deeds of this legendary figure amidst his status as a general in the Clone Wars. So why, in that moment, would Nari decide to state to that same man that he had absolutely no idea what Nari had been through? That he would even believe that statement considering that Obi-Wan was in the center of the storm of the war and was betrayed by his own troopers. That he would even believe this statement when Obi-Wan was the one to leave a security message warning all surviving Jedi to stay away from the temple, in turn causing Obi-Wan to witness firsthand the carnage of the clones' attack on the temple. It does not follow that Nari could have been made so aware of Obi-Wan's status in the Clone Wars as a ranking member of the Jedi Council, but somehow not know that his clones turned on him as well, as that was the root cause of the destruction of the Jedi and the rise of the Empire. That Nari could be so shocked as to how much Obi-Wan has changed due to the preceding events is unbelievable. It also makes one wonder how Nari was able to find Obi-Wan in the middle of the desert. If it is to be that he was able to sense Obi-Wan, then that would make the entire opening scene with the Inquisitors pointless, as he would have been able to have sensed the Jedi and immediately been able to capture him. If your writing makes it so that the following events are to contradict what came before, it is a sign that the writing quality is not on par with the objective of attempting to tell a coherent story. We then go to Alderaan, a planet we had only seen destroyed in Episode 4 and briefly towards the end of Revenge of the Sith. We are then given a montage of a figure being dressed, only for the Queen to enter the room and notice that the young girl being dressed was an alien that the Queen's daughter had coined for a prank. If these servants are aware that their Queen is hosting an important event, yet they would decide to sabotage the event by making the daughter of the Queen and the Queen herself late to the event simply for the sake of a prank, then it must be that these servants are quite unreliable. We then see a young Princess Leia running through the woods, accompanied by a small droid that Disney only decided to include as a campaign for marketing a new toy. Upon discovering her daughter, the Queen, Bria, punishes Leia by taking away her droid named Lola. Leia protests this, saying that there is no blame to be had on the part of the droid, seeming to misinterpret the fact that it is her being punished and not the droid. Before I have any comments stating that this is the point as she is only 10 years old, that point would simply be rebuffed for the fact that the Queen acknowledges Leia's intellect and stating that if she were only more well behaved that she would have been a senator by that point. Soon thereafter, we are given another shot of the shaky cam in order to introduce several villains hidden amongst the woods watching the Queen and Leia. That the King and Queen would not have a perimeter surrounding the length of their house, nor any measure of a security gate, shows just how foolish they are in being so openly trusting in the idea that they are so completely safe as to not install any protective measures. We then return to Tatooine yet again to see Obi-Wan having continued his day-to-day routine. Upon having returned to his rider, he is confronted by Owen, who destroys the gift Obi-Wan had left for Luke, warning him to stay away. Obi-Wan tells Owen that Luke must be trained when the time is right, to which Owen counters that he should avoid that possibility lest he risk another Vader. It is an interesting dynamic that falls flat when what we are being led to understand is that Obi-Wan is perfectly willing to train Luke as a Jedi when he is older in order to defeat both the Empire and the Sith, as well as revitalizing the Jedi Order, but is simultaneously willing to let the Jedi Order die by giving up any hope on the Jedi being able to return. It is quite the stretch to believe that the same individual that had left a message warning all remaining Jedi to survive by trusting only in the Force in order to survive, so that a new hope may eventually emerge, is the same individual who would be willing to let the Jedi Order die while simultaneously contradicting himself. That he wants to train Luke as he understands that it would be essential in bringing down the Empire, but somehow believes that overthrowing the Empire would not cause the Jedi to return. Somehow believing that the Jedi can return, while believing that they can't, while believing that they can. This line is yet another prime example in regards to the issues with the writing. If the entire premise of your show is to base it on the notion that Obi-Wan has cut himself off from the Force, then how can it be expected that he would end up training Luke when he is older? If the idea is that Obi-Wan would to decide to reconnect with the Force in order to do so, then that idea alone will go completely against Obi-Wan's entire point for staying on the planet in the first place. That being that he was only staying so that he would be able to protect Luke until the time came to train him. However, if it is his goal to protect him, then burying the first tool he would need to do so, his lightsaber, and cutting himself off from the second necessary tool, the Force, would not aid him in doing so. This is why when writing your story that you establish the groundwork for how your character will revolve around the story. If your character is making world-altering decisions based on their own inability to make intelligent decisions, then why should we bother to give any sort of investment? Instead of saying, the boy must be trained, have Obi-Wan say, I have a plan, but for now I must stay hidden. It would suggest that he is still connected to the Force and it would not end up contradicting his character. One simple line change could have kept the character of Obi-Wan intact while staying consistent. If Obi-Wan's belief is that in training Luke that it will be essential in stopping the Empire, then it does not follow that he would simultaneously not believe that the Jedi Order could possibly be resurrected. That still would not explain Obi-Wan's reasoning for cutting himself off from the Force in his own training if his overall plan was to train Luke when he was older. Soon thereafter, the fifth brother and third sister arrive, which would seem to be quite inconvenient for these characters while simultaneously being convenient for the plot that the enemy faction has arrived at the moment that both Obi-Wan and Owen are discussing the possibility of Luke being trained as a Jedi, only for the very same people who hunt Jedi to arrive at that very same moment. The fifth brother then states to the crowd that they know why the Inquisitors are there, that there is a Jedi hidden on their planet. Upon a local civilian stating that they are outside of the Empire's jurisdiction, the third sister uses that as an opportunity to slice off the civilian's hand only to then state that all that they request is information. If information was indeed the only tool that they required, then they simply could have read any civilian's mind in order to do so, rather than slicing off the hand of a random passerby. It is even more contrived that out of all of the locals present in that moment that the third sister would then choose to question Owen Lars of all people. If the counter to that was that she only noticed him because he was looking at her, then that would simply fall apart when you stop to consider that any individual at that moment would have been plenty horrified at having witnessed any innocent bystander lose their hand with a glowing red sword that could not only cut through, but instantly cauterize any wound. When she confronts Owen, she surmises that he is a farmer, that he must have a wife and children, and that he must be hiding the Jedi that they are looking for. However, if that argument were to be applied, then she would have immediately known that Owen had been in contact with Obi-Wan and ascertained the location from his mind. This is why it is so fundamentally imperative that your script be redrafted in order to fix any glaring issues that may counter the canon that had already been established. Throwaway lines are perfectly reasonable unless they create scenarios that could ultimately ruin your story, which is happening in this exact moment. Much like Nari being able to locate Obi-Wan in the middle of nowhere several hundred miles outside of the city he had just departed with the possibility of having sensed him, surely an Inquisitor would have been able to sense that same Jedi only a few feet away from her current position. It is only proven when Owen states that his family is of no concern to the Inquisitors, to which the third sister believes the Jedi they are searching for to be on that farm. Again, if she were to read his mind, she would have discovered Obi-Wan's location. Arbitrarily ignoring established mechanics in your world building does not constitute a level of adequacy if you are so focused on your story that you would so blatantly ignore what had come before. The third sister then states how Owen protects his family, which is quite an unnecessary statement, as most individuals would want to do that for their families. She then continues, questioning Owen as to whether he truly believes that he could protect his family from her. Yet another unnecessary statement coming from this character as she is continuing to harass this innocent man for no reason. She then threatens the entire population into revealing the location of the Jedi lest she kill Owen and his entire family. That out of all the people there that you would choose to threaten Owen Lars is such an ineffective means in creating any tension, considering that we all know that these characters will survive so that the OT may happen. What the writers intended to come off as intimidating has only resulted in an exposition dump of clunkily written dialogue that only ends up portraying this character as an unintelligent, annoying, bumbling idiot. That the other Inquisitors are constantly berating this character for acting in such a rash manner does not make her case any better.
Stand down, third sister. You will forget this fixation with Kenobi, or I will relieve you of your duties. Is that clear?
You are too impulsive. Be careful, third sister. You go too far.
The fifth brother proves this when he sets down a fob with an image of the Jedi they are hunting with the promise of a reward, only to continue by reprimanding the third sister for being too impulsive. Before they both leave, she threatens Owen by whispering,
Next time.
All that this will accomplish is making the viewer confused as to why she is so angry at that specific individual for no reason other than the plot needing to artificially forge a connection between these two characters. If the fifth brother is to be this frustrated in allowing for the third sister in taking charge and leading their raids, then why would he not instead choose to do that himself? Give this character some sort of background. Allow for the audience to understand why he has earned his rank amongst the Inquisitors rather than having him stand in the sidelines watching his comrade make the Empire and the other Inquisitors look like fools. The fifth brother has only become nothing more than a mere side character used only for the express purpose of challenging the third sister, and in doing so, only continue to create an even higher level of contradictions. When the fifth brother questions the third sister as to what she believes she will gain in capturing Kenobi, she responds with,
When I'm old.
With that one line that has absolutely no correlation with what the fifth brother had even asked, we are given yet another glimpse into what the writers believe to be competent writing. After the departure of the Inquisitors, Obi-Wan then goes to Owen and thanks him, as if the whole purpose of Obi-Wan's hiding was to avoid detection because of the paranoia in the Inquisitors' belief that Owen was hiding a Jedi, only for some random individual to emerge thanking him. If any one of these random passing civilians were to hear that exchange, one might presume that that individual would be able to come to the conclusion that Obi-Wan was a Jedi. While Obi-Wan's connection to the Force may have been diminished, his plot armor is still quite strong. We then return to Alderaan yet again, where we arrive at the event that the Queen had been so anxious for earlier. We are then given a glimpse of C-3PO because, why not? Disney sure does love their nostalgia, don't they? Upon having thanked to serve a droid for her drink, Leia's cousin mocks her for her level of courtesy, commenting that droids are lower life forms before insulting her for being adopted. What is both interesting and highly implausible about this scene is that up to this point, the only people that are aware of Leia's true lineage are Yoda, Obi-Wan, Bail, and his wife. It would be so imperative to Bail and Bria in maintaining the facade of Leia's status as an Organa that they would continue to do so in order to protect her from the Empire. That her cousin could have found out simply because his father had told him is even more ridiculous, as the only way that Leia's uncle would have been informed is if either Bria or Bail themselves mentioned the fact. If that were indeed the case, then that would simply be another issue of the writers actively ruining established characters off-screen. That Leia's cousin could so casually have mentioned it while insulting her is proof that this is slowly becoming one of the worst kept secrets in the Organa family if they are all aware of the fact. Not even Leia herself should know this, considering that she is at an age where most children would not have the capability in being mature enough to maintain that knowledge without accidentally revealing it. If anything, it would be the better alternative for Bail or Bria were to create a scenario in which no one besides themselves were to know that Leia was adopted. Wanting to keep this child's heritage a secret from the Empire is imperative in her being able to not only survive, but to prevent her from being outed by the universe for being the daughter of the second most feared entity in the galaxy, being Darth Vader. The alternative solution would have been to have created the legal documents necessary to hide the fact. Whether the documents were forged or legitimate, considering the number of resources at their disposal, considering their status as the ruling family of this planet, that they would be able to hide something with such a measure of secrecy and subtlety. A second option would have been to create a scenario in which they would hide a pregnancy, in which the Queen would create a fake appearance of pregnancy in order to lend credence to the idea that she wanted to make a surprise announcement to her people. Not as many people would question the possibility, and both Bail and Bria would have had the added benefit of keeping the secret from the galaxy. We had already seen this with Padme being able to hide her pregnancy from not only her own planet, but from the entirety of the Galactic Senate and Republic, her pregnancy only having been announced by Palpatine in an effort to further create a level of discourse between the people and the Jedi by spurring on the idea that the Jedi had killed Padme when it was actually Vader. Having it instead be that their other family was told off-screen for the sake of wanting to show Leia as being the better individual would have been a reasonable explanation if not having been based on the premise of such a contrived setup. Leia then uses this moment as an opportunity to silently rebuke her cousin for always following under his father's shadow without ever making his own decisions, that he will never truly rise above anything if he is to never become independent. Her mother later chastises Leia for her comment, to which Leia rebuffs, stating that her cousin was being rude to the guests and bigoted towards the droids. Bria's response to that is,
"He's your cousin."
This is quite a confusing and, quite honestly, pathetic statement for an adult to make to their child as a means of teaching a lesson if that adult is willing to let someone else be rude and bigoted simply because they are a family member. Whether or not there is a familial relation between any two individuals should not matter in the context of doing what is morally correct. Bria then attempts to justify this baseless claim by stating that Leia must rise above it, which is simply even more frustrating given the context that she was indeed rising above the taunts of her cousin by pointing out the hypocrisy of her cousin and mocking the heritage of Leia when he himself could not stand alone as an individual. That her daughter was acting on the accepted notion of morality should earn her the approval of her mother rather than being reprimanded. It would have presented an opportunity for the writer to have Leia be bullied for her adopted status and allowing for the audience to understand the alienness in which Leia would feel towards her family and their inability to empathize with their daughter. That her family would have to deal with a lack of understanding because of Leia's inability and being able to deal with her adopted status because of her young age. The idea that she could have everything she would ever want, but still feel so separate from everyone else rather than getting teased simply for the sake of being a decent human being. We are only given a brief glimpse at this possibility when Leia states to Bail that she isn't a real Organa, causing him to comfort his daughter in stating that she is indeed an Organa in every way. It lends credence to the notion that blood is not a qualitative measurement of family, it is by a level of love that connects them. It is an unfortunate circumstance that this is an idea that could have been explored but was ultimately dropped for the sake of flash and spectacle, rather than the substance. It is that substance that shines through in what little interaction we are given here between Bail and his daughter, reminding his daughter that she is loved, all the while reminding her of her status and the role that she must eventually undertake, while gently suggesting that she apologizes, all the more appealing rather than her mother scolding her daughter for being a decent person. At this point, Leia has immediately run out into the woods, where we then see Bail inform his wife of the fact. Yet again, one is left to wonder why and how she was able to sneak past their security in order to wander into the forest. Not only that fact presenting its own set of problems, but that Bail is well aware enough of how often his daughter has done this in the past, yet has not assigned a guard to monitor her movements, nor implanted any sort of tracker or chip on his daughter begs the question of just the level of care he would have for his daughter. The idea that the writer would ever even entertain the notion that the inciting incident in which Obi-Wan is led to abandon his mission in protecting the last remaining hope of the galaxy in a last-ditch effort in saving the daughter of a royal family, all for the sake of that very same ruler being unable to hire a babysitter, is absolutely insane. That this individual would not track his daughter, considering the level of significance her status carries, only goes to portray this character in a way that would make one question as to whether this individual ever truly cared for his daughter. In knowing who exactly her true father was, to go to such an extreme measure of effort in attempting to hide her heritage in order to protect her simply to allow her to wander into the woods by her lonesome at any given moment without any form of protection is baffling. Not only to how little his expressed concern is in locating his daughter, but with how slowly he is moving in his attempt at locating her continues to add to the question of just how desperate this man may truly be in wanting to protect his daughter if he is to do so in such a lackadaisical manner. Upon returning to the forest, we see Leia running to a point that she immediately stops when she has noticed a figure standing in place. How Leia was unable to notice this figure despite her having been looking directly at him as she was running in that direction is only just the beginning of a long list of questionable actions in a moment preceding perhaps one of the most contrived scenes in this entire show. Upon the man greeting her, rather than turning around and immediately running away, she simply asks,
"Why are you here?"
For almost any young individual, it has been constantly drilled into them at a young age by their parents to always be alert for any level of danger a stranger may pose. For some reason, Bale and his wife did not seem to care enough to inform their only daughter of the importance in understanding the term stranger danger. When the man states that he was waiting, Leia responds with,
"For what?"
Why she is still not left is unknown, but the man then replies that he was waiting for her before we see two other mercenaries surrounding her. Leia then finally turns around and begins to run away, in which the mercenaries finally give chase. Why the two henchmen did not immediately grab her or even begin to chase Leia until she had started to run is quite confusing in and of itself. We then see 3 guards leave the Organa home, and it is a bizarre moment in terms of the editing in which the scene is accompanied by a quickly paced melody in the score. Yet these individuals, who are not only hired by the monarch and patriarch of the planet to protect their home and daughter, were told by those same 2 people that their daughter, the princess of that planet, cannot be found, and yet they are moving at a leisurely pace. One might hope that these guards would attempt to make more of an effort in locating the princess of the ruling family on their planet, but that would be a step towards logical consistency, and we all know how Disney feels about that. We then return to Leia being chased by the 2 mercenaries, and it is absolutely horrifying. That the scene would be accompanied by a measure of highly paced music in order to garner any level of tension when you stop to consider that 3 fully grown adults are unable to properly catch up to a 10-year-old. Not only is the style alone bizarre, but the way in which the showrunners believe that having the alien mercenary run in a fashion all too similar to a penguin modeling is so utterly pathetic that it is so truly bizarre that anyone could have ever taken this moment seriously. As one of the mercenaries continues the chase, we see that he is only 3 feet away from her, only for Leia to slide underneath a fallen tree in order to escape. It is all the more worse when you stop and realize that the only reason that they set this shot up at a low angle was so that any audience member wouldn't have any time to see just how truly low this tree was in relation to the man's overall height. And just how truly absurd this henchman must be if he chose to double back instead of either jumping over or going around the tree. The green alien henchman then takes a moment to stand still and shout at Leia, causing her to notice him before he decides to continue the chase. If he had simply kept quiet and not alerted his presence to her, he would have been able to have immediately caught her. Then again, this same individual was running like a penguin earlier and has been consistently struggling to catch a 10-year-old child. Perhaps I've gone too far ahead in stating that there's hardly any consistency in Disney's Star Wars franchise, considering that this moment shows how consistent these characters are in being so harebrained that they would rather move at a brisk jog to then being stopped by a tree that they could have simply jumped over or gone around. Much like how Leia had run into the forest earlier while looking forward in a way that she would have immediately noticed the henchman waiting for her but was somehow unable to. This henchman is somehow unable to see the very obvious branch that his target has run under only until he ends up running into it. This is not even on the same level of ridiculousness as The Three Stooges, as that show is able to cleverly use the cheesiness of slapstick comedy to its advantage. Here, it is simply horrifying to watch this moment unfold before our very eyes, when the premise is to be based on the idea that we're supposed to be taking the idea of Leia being possibly captured in such a serious manner when something as stupid as this will come along to ruin that very idea. As Leia crawls up and over several fallen trees, the henchman on the left stops to step over the branches when he could have jumped over the much thinner branch on the right. The henchman behind the green alien then decides to run into a clump of trees, only to then stop to bring his hands up to stop himself from hitting the tree despite the fact that it was never in his way. He then jumps to the side, even though he could have continued running on the very clear path as before, but that would imply that this individual carries any level of common sense. The green henchman then trips over the clump of branches which, again, could have been avoided if he had simply stepped over the single much thinner branch off to the side. Leia then is able to slip between two trees and the henchmen decide to go off on the other path filled with wood that they could have possibly and inevitably would trip over instead of the path to the left, which had a much clearer path. We then see a guard arrive who takes notice of Leia to only get shot by one of the henchmen in his effort to save Leia. Why this guard would not have drawn his weapon after noticing how distressed Leia was, along with how deep into the woods she was, is simply confusing. One of the henchmen arrives, and much like the fifth brother from earlier, his target is perfectly within arm's reach to grab, but this henchman simply stands still and lets Leia turn and continue running away. Leia is then cornered and a bag is placed over her head, cutting to black and allowing for the audience to take a well-deserved trip to the toilet to let out all of our disappointment. I'd like to step away for a moment in order to reference the opening of Star Wars Episode 4: A New Hope. In the opening scene, we see that Leia's ship, the Tantive 4, has been captured by the Empire and a group of stormtroopers led by Darth Vader has boarded her ship. Vader then orders his men to capture any remaining targets in order to ascertain the location of the stolen Death Star plans. Upon Princess Leia having recorded her message to R2-D2, we see that a squad of stormtroopers have arrived. Noticing Leia, one of the troopers comments,
"There's one, set for stun."
After having killed one of the stormtroopers, the troopers then fire off a stun blast which knocks Leia unconscious. With the level of technology that has been established in the lore of the Star Wars universe, the implementation of a weapon such as the stun gun is yet another unique tool in the wider story of this universe. So then why, out of all of the possible scenarios that these henchmen could have decided upon, did they believe that chasing a 10-year-old child in the woods was the better alternative than bringing a gun that would have ended this farce of a chase immediately?
I think, one of the biggest things that we wanted to bring to this one is, we wanted to be very respectful of the canon and to make sure, that we were lining up with everything. But
actually, no, that's not the truth.
But at the same time, do something new and tell a new story. And I think one of the most interesting things that we have in the show is that we are with characters that we know and love.
Not anymore.
But we're at a different point in their lives. The other thing I was able to do is that while we were developing the scripts, I was thinking already about stagecraft and already thinking, does this scene make sense for the technology? Is it the best use of it? And we could sort of shape what we were actually writing to use the strengths of the volume.
That was a lie.
Let's break this down, shall we? That Leia had been known to wander into the woods but was never given any type of tracker in the case of being lost or captured is just absurd. That Leia, as the princess of the ruling family of the planet, would never have been escorted by any guard or form of protection is just absurd. That Leia was allowed to escape into the woods without anyone noticing is just absurd. That Leia was running in a way that she should and would have noticed this man but didn't is just absurd. That Leia decided to have a conversation with a complete stranger in the middle of the woods rather than immediately running away to safety is just absurd. That this henchman did not immediately grab her as his goal was to capture her is just absurd. That none of these henchmen grabbed Leia while she was distracted is just absurd. That this specific henchman is running like a penguin is just absurd. That these 3 fully grown adults are unable to catch a child immediately is just absurd. That this henchman was stopped by a thin branch rather than jumping over or going around it is just absurd. That this henchman didn't notice this branch until he ran into it is just absurd. That this henchman had the element of surprise but instead chose to give away his position is just absurd. That this henchman saw his target run under a branch and then decide to make the conscious effort to run into that same branch is just absolutely absurd. That this henchman on the right would run into a clump of trees rather than staying on the very obvious path, only to waste time by jumping to the side, is just absurd. That this henchman would choose to jump over a group of branches rather than the single, more thin branch, only to trip and fall, is just absurd. That these 2 henchmen would take a path that would only cause them to fall and slow them down even more, rather than taking the clear path on the left, is just absurd. That this one guard was shot down in such a pathetic manner by a group of even more pathetic individuals is simply absurd. That this henchman would simply stand in place and let Leia stop, turn, and run away again rather than grabbing her is simply absurd. That none of these henchmen decided to use a stun gun in order to immediately capture their target when they knew that there was a possibility of any form of resistance such as the armed security guards, but chose to partake in a wild bantha chase is just absurd. The entirety of this chase sequence, the lack of any semblance of coordination on the part of these henchmen, the absolute ridiculousness of the notion that a 10-year-old child could outrun any fully grown adult was just ridiculous. What was presented in such a manner that the showrunners would have ever possibly entertained the notion that any intelligent individual could have ever been expected to take this chase scene in any form of seriousness is just absurd. That any Disney executive could have seen this scene and given any form of approval is just absurd. If the idea was to show the character of a young Leia Organa being resourceful in her ability in being able to escape these henchmen, then that is immediately ruined by not only the inability of these henchmen in attempting to capture her, but in the fact that Leia did not immediately run away when encountering this stranger. Not only that, but that she would choose to run deeper into the woods rather than back to the home that she knows has a security force of armed guards is just absurd. This moment was not only bad, but it is now ranked as one of, if not the stupidest, moments in any of the Star Wars media. The entirety of this scene could have been fixed simply in having the scene play out in Leia running into the leader, only to have the bag placed over her head before cutting to black. The mission would have been a success, and there would have been no requirement in the studio in forcing its audience to witness one of the most ridiculously contrived moments in the series in such an idiotic manner.
Now, let's talk about the latest aspect of your career, which is, it's quite extraordinary. You've been all these years in movies, and now all of a sudden you've hit the jackpot with a thing called Star Wars. What's the fascination of it to you, do you think?
I think a marvelous, healthy innocence.
Yes.
Great pace, wonderful to look at, full of guts, nothing unpleasant. I mean, people go bang, bang, and people fall over and are dead, but no horrors, no sleazy sex. In fact, actually, no sex at all if it comes to that. And a sort of wonderful freshness about it, kind of like a wonderful fresh air.
It's great to be in them. What I love about being in Star Wars is the kids. When kids come up to me and they ask me, did you really cut Darth Maul in half? And how does your lightsaber work? And all those things. I love that.
His attempt to try and emulate a great actor who has an enormous amount of respect for is one thing, but what he's done in the process is he's brought the greatness of that character to himself and his own performance.
There is a phenomenon in Star Wars that was built in when I started, which is I was hiring actors sometimes for 10 years, and I was hiring them very young. So I was able to use their maturity over the years as part of the character. In the case of Ewan, he starts out as a Padawan learner, and then he ends up as a very sophisticated Jedi Master. And as he's grown into the part, he's gotten even better at the physical aspects of the character, between the films as they grew older.
With how much the planet of Tatooine has been utilized as a plot device in which every story must revolve around this planet, it is with a level of irony in that there is only such a small level of relief in being able to return after the absolute debacle that was the previous chase scene. We then return to Obi-Wan, who has received a call on his transponder. Bail and Bria have contacted Obi-Wan to inform him of Leia's capture. Bail makes it a point to state how the kidnappers left no ransom, they have no leads, and that the kidnappers knew where Leia would be. Considering how often Leia will sneak away into the woods, that statement may have had some level of credibility if not for the very fact that Leia had been known to sneak off at random intervals. Supposing that these criminals were aware that Leia would sneak off into the woods, then that would suggest that these criminals were hiding in the woods for such an unspecified amount of time, relying only on the slim possibility that Leia would go into the woods at any random interval, which is quite absurd. Bria tells Obi-Wan that they need him specifically due to their unwillingness to trust anyone else to locate and save their daughter, which is absolutely insane. In this point in time in the canonical timeline of the Star Wars universe, the Empire is the ruling faction governed by the Imperial Senate, the very same organization that Bail Organa is a sitting member of. That this individual who is the ruling monarch of one of the planets that is connected to that very same Senate would not raise the issue of his daughter having been kidnapped is quite questionable. As we saw that Bail had sent out a few guards to locate Leia, establishing that there is, whether it be small or large, an established security force on their planet. Not only having that level of access to that protection, but logic would demand that he would not only have the security resources of not only an entire planet, but the Empire itself to help find his kidnapped daughter due to his being a member of the Imperial Senate. Even if he were to distrust any established organization for fear of the secret of his daughter's heritage in being revealed, but why not go for a more subtle approach in hiring a bounty hunter? Any one individual who is, by profession, trained to seek out and locate those targets they are hunting in exchange for a reward. We had seen plenty of bounty hunters on Tatooine in Episode 4, which took place only 9 years after this show. The prequels made it a point to show that bounty hunters existed in multiple areas of the galaxy as well. Not only would a bounty hunter be one of the best alternative solutions, but out of all of the individuals in the galaxy that would never care enough to look into Leia's lineage would be a bounty hunter. There would be absolutely no purpose in them attempting to discover Leia's lineage, as the only info they would have been given at the time would have been that this is the daughter of the royal family of Alderaan. That alone would carry so much weight and worth in terms of monetary compensation alone to encourage almost any bounty hunter or hunters to want to save Bael's daughter even more. The risk in her heritage being discovered by a bounty hunter would be quite slim. There would be no reason to worry about the risk of this information leaking, as the bounty hunters would only be concerned about how much money Bael would be willing to pay in order for Leia's safe return. Not only that, but as bounty hunters, they are hired on the premise of work for hire by the individuals they are making deals with. As they were not considered illegal by the Republic during the prequels, nor during the original trilogy, it would make more sense to hire these individuals, as they would not be restricted to traveling the galaxy like Obi-Wan would be for the sake of being a wanted criminal. That Bael would ignore all of these resources at his disposal in an effort to save his daughter by risking the connection he harbors with one of the most highly classed criminals in the galaxy is absurd. Bael's plan is to contact the one individual that has no access to a ship, very limited money, has foregone his connection with the Force while simultaneously ignoring any lightsaber training for a decade, and must steal slivers of meat from his job to feed both his pet and himself, rather than contacting the very organization that is currently ruling the galaxy to save his daughter. How interesting a scenario could have been if the story called upon having the Empire be tasked with finding Leia, being shown how the inner workings of the Empire functions in regards to the day-to-day life of the average stormtrooper, or even following a small group of higher-ranked stormtroopers being charged in locating the kidnapped daughter of one of the planets they oversee. That the Empire would have been successful in locating Bael's daughter and returning her safely, causing Bael to have even an iota of doubt in his desperation in leading a rebellion against the same people who had saved his daughter. But no. Instead, we were given this. Why not have the show be presented on the premise of Bael hiring a personal bodyguard for Leia? It would fit in line with the image of a member of the royal family of Alderaan needing a protection detail, while showing a measure of frustration on the part of Leia in being forced to be watched by this one guard whom she would have absolutely no relationship with. You could have had the guard slowly but surely break through Leia's stubbornness in order to get her to open up more. We could have had several moments in which Leia, despite all of her wealth and material possessions, being able to confide in the soldier that she would only ever wish for the validation and comfort of a friend, which that guard could be. By the end of the story, have the guard sacrifice his life for Leia in a moment of desperation and love for his friend. Before the argument is to be made that it is only because we didn't get these specific stories that led to disappointment, I would like to point out that these are simply alternative stories that could have had a more appealing narrative as opposed to what was actually shown based on a series of plot contrivances and character assassinations. Rather than utilize any of these story elements or possible alternatives in saving Leia, what was decided as the naturally intelligent thing to do in this situation is ignore all of that and call in the only man who is one of the most wanted criminals in the galaxy. His involvement risking the exposure of the fact that if he were to be discovered, that the safety of Luke would be endangered, which would end up destroying the last chance of the Jedi returning in their effort to defeating both the Empire and the Sith. To put it bluntly, in order for the plot to occur, every character must be forced to act in such a manner that will lead to the eventual derailment of their established character development and having them act on such heinously idiotic choices. Obi-Wan even states that the Senate could be contacted, in which Bael counters by stating that he does not want the knowledge of this event to become public, which is a contradiction in and of itself, as any concerned parent would want their child in being located. The more people that are aware would lead to a higher chance in Leia being found and returned. When Obi-Wan asks why not a guard or a bounty hunter could be used, Bael informs Obi-Wan of the fact.
Only you know how important she really is, Obi-Wan.
Supposing we were to exclude the fact that Yoda, Obi-Wan, Bael, and Bria knew Leia's true heritage as the daughter of Darth Vader, she is still the daughter of the king and queen of one of the most prominent planets in the galaxy. Not only that, but that she is a member of the royal family of that planet would illustrate how important she truly is. Obi-Wan informs Bael that he cannot perform this act as his duty is to stay on Tatooine to watch over Luke, to which Bael says that Leia is just as important to them as Luke is to Obi-Wan. Again, if they view their daughter in such a light of importance, perhaps they should have banished the thought of contacting the one individual that the Empire is sending members of the Sith after. Obi-Wan then shuts off the connection and Leia is seen being tied up by her kidnappers before being locked away. Obi-Wan continues in his day-to-day activities, taking the train back to town before noticing a crowd gathering. Here we see the Jedi Nari from earlier having been killed and hung his body from the rafters. What is odd here is that this was an opportunity for the show to have any moment in which the grim reality of the Inquisitors could have been displayed in such a manner that the story would have been able to accentuate just how dark the subject matter could have truly been. Even as something as simple as only showing the feet of the dead Jedi, or instead not even showing the Jedi but having the crowd react in a manner that would suggest just how truly far the Inquisitors will go in order to preserve the order of the Empire. Instead, it comes across as a jarring moment, as no one would ever truly display someone in such a state, as it would only come off as looking ridiculous. That the Jedi's head is still propped up instead of being angled down, considering that he is hanging at such an angle that shouldn't even be happening. Upon Obi-Wan's return to his cave, there is another issue that arises that needs to be addressed. When having returned to his cave earlier in the episode, we had seen a small droid scanner emerge from the ground. In this instance, however, the light flashing on the scanner is red as opposed to the blue from earlier. Based upon that information, one could only presume that it is a sentry droid of some kind, a preliminary form of security in the event should someone attempt to intrude upon Obi-Wan's dwelling. The issue here is that Obi-Wan's reaction upon seeing the warning status of the droid is to then enter his cave that he is aware has been infiltrated. As he has foregone his connection to the Force, there would be some level of merit in his having installed a sentry droid surrounding the perimeter of his home. The issue with that, however, is a repeat of the original issue of Obi-Wan having cut himself off from the Force in the first place, despite both it and his lightsaber being the tools necessary in protecting both Luke and himself from any immediate danger. But supposing the censor were to inform Obi-Wan of the fact of any level of danger, it would be prudent for him to immediately retreat back into the city until he feels the level of danger has passed. Not only that, but the fact that he would be so aware of the possibility and the risk of danger being presented that he would then choose to go into the same cave that the droid that he himself had installed had previously warned him not to go into. We see just the level of trepidation in Obi-Wan when he slowly approaches this cloaked figure, who turned out to be Bail. If the counter-argument to this would have been that there was never any need to worry as it was simply Bail coming to see Obi-Wan, that is a conclusion based on the knowledge of the audience and knowing that Obi-Wan would be perfectly fine only so that his character could continue to appear in the original trilogy. The character of Obi-Wan in this world of this universe is unaware of the identity of this figure. This is a situation that never should have arose in the first place. But much is the habit of Disney turning every character in this universe into a clueless idiot, it's not completely unexpected that Obi-Wan would be foolish enough to approach an area that he was aware posed a threat simply for the meta-knowledge of the audience and knowing that there was never any danger, despite the show presenting all of the evidence to suggest that very same outcome. One would hope that this character, who has been labeled as the Empire's most wanted criminal for the sake of being a Jedi, that he would have some measure of higher security surrounding the perimeter of his home that would consist of something far more elaborate than a droid who's been buried in the sand. Even something as simple as planting several hidden mines in a certain pattern around the line surrounding the entrance to the cave would show some degree of cautiousness on the part of Obi-Wan. Just because you force your character to give up on their beliefs in such a contrived and unbelievable way does not mean that you have to reduce their intelligence to a point that it would make any casual viewer of this show roll their eyes at the complete ineptitude of this brainless oaf. Bail reveals to Obi-Wan that the ship that is carrying Leia had used a freight transport in order to hide their signature. This line would be fine if not for the fact that this line came after Bail had informed Obi-Wan that the ship is currently headed to a planet named Daiyu. One might reasonably assume that if Bail was to come across this information in knowing the destination planet for his daughter, that he would then choose to inform his security detail, any bounty hunter, or even the Empire. Instead, he risked exposing one of the few remaining Jedi by the fact that he is the king of a planet, and yet he decided to sneak to a desert planet in order to confront the man that is being hunted by the Empire. If someone were to track Bail's location, or had taken notice of him at all, not only would Obi-Wan have been immediately arrested, but Bail would have been taken prisoner too for having consorted with an enemy of the Empire. When Obi-Wan informs Bail that he is no longer the man he once remembered, Bail responds that he will have to end up being that person again, which is quite questionable as to why he would act in such a way considering that he is well aware of all that Obi-Wan has gone through. That Bail could so nonchalantly inform the man who was forced to survive being betrayed by his comrades, discover the aftermath of the assault on the Jedi Temple, fight his former apprentice and watch him burn, and have to deal with the fact that he is now one of the few remaining people of the fallen Jedi Order is insulting. For him to state to this same individual quite literally that the past is the past, and that he needs to simply move on and be done with it does not convey any level of sympathy for this character, but rather illustrates just how ignorant and inconsiderate he is being despite how desperate he is to save his daughter that he wouldn't think twice to insult the same man that he is begging for help from. For Bail to say something like this is along the same lines as knowing somebody who has been depressed for so long and telling them to just be happy, as if that will solve any and all issues that that person is dealing with. That Bail would even say that Obi-Wan needs to be done with the past is an interesting statement, as Obi-Wan was doing just that by staying on Tatooine in an effort to stay hidden. Bail then states that Obi-Wan couldn't save Anakin, but he now has the opportunity to save Leia is even more of a confusing statement. In the aftermath of Obi-Wan's duel with Anakin, Bail had been informed by Obi-Wan and Yoda of the fact, along with being present for the birth of Luke and Leia. He is well aware of the events that Obi-Wan had dealt with. For him to so casually mention that he had failed to save the very same person whom he had seen as a brother with whom he trained since a young child is so inconsiderate that it borders on the line of insulting. Bail stating to Obi-Wan that he had failed with his apprentice, but now having the chance to save Leia is not an endearing choice, as Bail is merely using Obi-Wan's guilt over the entire event with Anakin as a means to guilt him into helping him when he has no prerogative in doing so. The ending of Revenge of the Sith made it explicitly clear that Bail had chosen to adopt Leia as his daughter, as it was Yoda's decision to keep both Luke and Leia safe by separation. It was Obi-Wan's decision to stay on Tatooine in order to watch over Luke. Bail is very well aware of this, but him choosing to ignore this does not have this character come across as intelligent, but idiotic. Even when Obi-Wan asks on the possibility of whether or not he can do it, Bail responds that there is no one he would trust more than Obi-Wan, which was not what Obi-Wan had even asked in the first place. What is the most disappointing and frustrating aspect of this exchange is in how Bail is so concerned in keeping Leia's heritage a secret, but that he never stopped to consider that hiring the most wanted criminal in the galaxy to go after her will only reveal just how important she is, which is the exact opposite of what is needed. The rationale that Bail and his wife had provided should only spur Obi-Wan further into wanting to stay on Tatooine to watch over and protect Luke. Bail's logic in not alerting the Senate or the Empire, but instead asking an illegal Jedi for help, is the real-life equivalent of not having the police or FBI track down your child who has been kidnapped, but instead going to the FBI's most wanted criminal to save your child. The logic is broken. Upon the transport arriving at Daiyu, Leia is then able to reach into her pocket where she pulls out Lola. Why none of these henchmen would have thought to search her for any weapons, trackers, or devices is ridiculous enough. But what is worse is the fact is in the way in which it is because of the incompetence of these henchmen which would have allowed for her to escape. That they would decide to use ropes to hold her when that is the whole purpose of binders is a baffling choice. It is only because of this incompetency on the henchmen's part in using ropes that allows them to catch Lola and then destroy it. We then return to Tatooine yet again, where we see that Obi-Wan has rode out to the middle of nowhere where he begins to dig. As this occurs, one of the henchmen voices that he feels that the whole operation in kidnapping a child is a bad idea. Why he would even say this now when he was so willing to go along with this plan earlier to the point of getting frustrated during the chase and being unable to catch that same child is bewildering. If this is an attempt by the showrunners in attempting to rationalize that any one of these henchmen having a change of heart shows that they are truly good individuals, then it will only fall apart, as we already saw the entirety of the chase scene in the woods. Obi-Wan eventually digs up a box buried deep in the ground. Opening it, we then see that it is Anakin and Obi-Wan's lightsabers, which is simply infuriating. To recap, Obi-Wan's plan was to watch over and protect Luke for any danger until he felt the time was right when he was older to begin his training. His plan in doing this in hopes that Luke will be able to bring down both the Sith and the Empire. However, his plan in protecting Luke consisted of him cutting himself off from the Force for the last decade while burying his lightsaber in the sand, all while forsaking any semblance of training for the past decade, all the while believing the Jedi Order has no chance whatsoever in returning. How do the showrunners write this way and expect anyone to take this seriously? We then see that the third sister has been in contact with the henchmen, where it is revealed that she was the one who had organized the entire kidnapping of Leia in hopes that it would draw Obi-Wan out from hiding. If this is indeed the third sister's plan, then how is it that Darth Vader did not think to do this himself? Perhaps it is due to Darth Vader being an intelligent individual with enough common sense in recognizing that haphazardly kidnapping a member of the royal family of one of the most renowned planets in the galaxy does not constitute maintaining galactic peace and maintaining an empire. How does it follow that the third sister would be capable enough to make the distinction between Bail and Obi-Wan being friends versus associates during a galactic-scale war? Obi-Wan was a ranking member of the Jedi Council, having earned his status as a Jedi Master. What doesn't follow is the idea that Obi-Wan would risk everything that he has in having dedicated his new life in protecting this one individual from harm for this one other child that was entrusted to be Bail's responsibility instead. The only way in which this could have been achieved was if the third sister had been made aware of the fact that Leia was Anakin's daughter, which is impossible and ridiculous to such a degree of contrivance if that were indeed the case. One must remember that the only people present that were made aware of this fact were Yoda, Obi-Wan, and Bail, as they were the only individuals present at Luke and Leia's birth. Somehow, the third sister had presumed that by kidnapping Leia, that would draw Obi-Wan out of hiding in order to find the daughter of whom the third sister surmised was a longtime friend of Obi-Wan. Yet for some reason, she did not think to follow that same person whom she believed to be the longtime friend of the very same individual she is hunting to the very same planet that her enemy is hiding. Not only does the third sister's plan carry so many levels of contrivance, but the new issue that arises is due to the very fact that there was even a connection between these two characters at all. If the third sister is able to deduce that Bail Organa, the ruling monarch of Alderaan, has been in contact with the very same individual that the Inquisitors and the Empire as a whole are hunting, would it not be beneficial to the Empire to bring in that very same individual for questioning? If the Empire were to be made aware of this connection, there would have been nothing preventing them in going to Alderaan and killing him. Much like how Grand Moff Tarkin had commented in Episode 4 that, per the completion of the Death Star, that upon the disbandment of the old council, that the regional governors would maintain direct control over their territories. It would not have been much of a stretch for them to quietly remove Bail from his position and replace him with one of their own leaders. Given how anti-Jedi the Empire is, they would have had probable cause for either imprisoning or outright killing whom they would have discovered to be a Jedi sympathizer, thus preventing the original trilogy from ever happening. That a member of the very same empire she is under wouldn't think to inform the very same organization that oversees her operations of her discovery is questionable enough, but that the events of this story will only result in the Empire knowing that Obi-Wan shares a connection with Bail. But for some unknown reason that they would instead decide to never act upon this information between the events of the show and A New Hope displays just how little thought was put into preserving any degree of continuity. All that will do is cause the Empire to look even more incompetent and both Bail and Obi-Wan to have such an enormous degree of plot armor that it borders on insanity. When you base the premise of your story on the elements of plot contrivances and conveniences, that does not necessarily constitute good writing, nor a strong story, as you are only relying on the audience to ignore any irregularities or inconsistencies in the world building, lore, its characters, and the overall narrative as a whole. That is not good storytelling. It is only lazy, desperate, depressing, and pathetic. In regards to the plot armor, it is highlighted when we see that Obi-Wan has arrived at a spaceport to gain passage to his next destination, where he is seen paying the worker there before reaching back to his pouch where his lightsaber is shown to the audience. While a visual cue in alerting the audience that he is planning on returning to the ways of the Force, it is portrayed in a foolish manner as the writers had Obi-Wan nonchalantly risk both his entire mission and his life just for the sake of showing his lightsaber. This was not a moment that was required, as we saw not even 2 minutes prior his having dug up his lightsaber. One could have reasonably assumed that he had brought his lightsaber with him, as the whole purpose of his digging up the lightsabers was so that he could retrieve his own before embarking on his journey. That he would so blatantly expose himself in front of this worker just because the showrunners wanted the visual of Obi-Wan's lightsaber has only served the purpose in portraying this character as out of character in such a frustratingly idiotic manner. Unfortunately, it is only the beginning of the end for this character for what this show has planned for him. What a mess. What a pathetic story. What an embarrassing introduction to a show reintroducing a fan-favorite character only to obliterate him. One could only hope that there will be any level of hope left, but Disney can only continue to milk this franchise for all it's worth while everyone blindly consumes it. Disney's ability in handling its franchises can be lended to the notion that it is much like a gardener. Everything that it touches dies, mainly due to Disney's inability in holding back their desire to poach what little remaining juice of creativity there was left after having destroyed every aspect of the original trilogy. Now having set their sight upon the prequels due to the complete and utterly dismal annihilation of their own trilogy. One cannot simply forget what little hope had remained in a conceited effort to regain any semblance of hope for the fan base by dredging up what little sense of nostalgia had remained, only for every consumer to blindly swallow whatever Disney was force-feeding them without stopping to consider just how truly destitute the quality of these shows were in their pathetic attempts at attempting to avoid the utter idiocy of the inability of the screenwriters and the boardroom at Disney. The Book of Boba Fett being a prime example of just how far one must go in order for any casual civilian to consider that episode of a deep-fake Luke Skywalker who acted nothing like the Luke that we'd once known and loved, to be considered the best episode of that show when it was truly one of the worst for the simple fact of one corporation's portrayal of a once favorite character acting completely out of character, that so few remaining individuals being able to recognize the desperation of any writer to have fallen so low.
I've accepted the truth that you were once Anakin Skywalker, my father. There is still good in him. I can save him, I can turn him back to the good side.
Your thoughts betray you, Father. I feel the good in you, the conflict.
I can't kill my own father. I know there is good in you. The Emperor hasn't driven it from you fully. There is good in him. I felt it. I feel the conflict within you. Let go of your hate. I am a Jedi, like my father before me. I'll not leave you here. I've got to save you.
You already have.
You will be giving in to attachment to those that you love, and forsaking the way of the Jedi.
You must complete the training.
I can't keep the vision out of my head. They're my friends. I gotta help them.
You will be giving in to attachment to those that you love, and forsaking the way of the Jedi.
You must not go.
But Han and Leia will die if I don't.
You will be giving in to attachment to those that you love, and forsaking the way of the Jedi.
It is you and your abilities the Emperor wants. That is why your friends are made to suffer.
That's why I have to go.
You will be giving in to attachment to those that you love, and forsaking the way of the Jedi.
Patience.
And sacrifice Han and Leia.
You will be giving in to attachment to those that you love, and forsaking the way of the Jedi.
I've accepted the truth that you were once Anakin Skywalker, my father.
You will be giving in to attachment to those that you love, and forsaking the way of the Jedi.
I'll not leave you here. I've got to save you.
You already have.
You will be giving in to attachment to those that you love, and forsaking the way of the Jedi.
Yet the ploy had somehow worked in Disney's attempt in returning from beyond the grave, for every blind consumer to have ended up watching just one episode of Kenobi to end up screaming, creaming, and clapping, without any attempt in using any ounce of common sense and understanding just how easily duped they had been. Then again, it is not too surprising when one stops to consider just how easily everyone was willing to lose their minds from seeing a young Luke Skywalker in The Mandalorian, when there was absolutely no level of setup or payoff for that one moment.
Oh, is it so? Maybe, we don't know. Probably.
Dude.
I say Luke.
Yep.
Oh my god. Who is this? There's no way.
Luke? No.
He's shook. Oh! Who is that? He's on lightsaber.
No.
No way.
Fucking
No
way.
way.
Is it Luke?
That's cool.
It's Luke. It's no way. Oh, you mean
So
him?
nice to look.
Oh,
Skip
it's him.
was scared.
It's totally him. Yeah. Yes.
Yes.
Green. Oh. Who is it? A green lightsaber. Oh my God! Is it Luke? I'm sorry.
It's green lightsaber!
Look at how terrified he is. It's Luke, my God!
There's no way this is Luke Skywalker. There's no.
Is it Luke? No. What? Is this Luke? It's Luke!
Oh, it's Luke! Oh my God!
Oh my god.
Oh, it's like deep faked. Wow.
That looks good.
Oh, yes!
Oh,
shit!
What?
Oh my gosh, it looks good!
They did it. Wow. They just full on did it.
Wow.
Oh,
What the hell?
they freaking Oh my god, that's so cool!
Then again, these are the same people that were able to watch something so fundamentally fragmented and become so ignorant in their inability to comprehend just how absolutely flawed this media has become in the last decade under Disney's leadership. One could have only hoped that Ewan McGregor would have been able to have assessed the quality, or lack thereof, of the Star Wars franchise in the past few years. But perhaps like Mark Hamill, he had been initially roped in with the promise of a faithful reintroduction of this fan-favorite character only to recoil in horror at the prospect that it was far too late to leave as the damage had already been done.